The British Workers' Party is at a dead end. Now, most people, a lot of people at least, would say, so what? Because they don't know what the British Workers' Party is and they don't really care. I'd like to explain what I mean when I say the British Workers' Party is a dead end. George Galloway, its leader, has a very racy and popular talk show where he engages people from phone calls around the world and has guests who represent the side of the established narrative that we call alternative podcasting. It's the view that imperialism has made um, the West a pariah and that Israel is the snapping end of the Western pariah imperialism state. And it engages various other issues from around the world. Um, Tends to be mediative on the subject of Ukraine rather than openly pro-Western. It's openly engaging of Russia. And when I was coming of age in politics as a deaf man, I had an interest in things that I enjoyed about American heritage, which were coming under question. I enjoyed Mark Twain. I enjoyed The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, which always brought out incredible screechiness because of what kind of ideology Ayn Rand promoted. But The Fountainhead was a pretty good book. It was about the troubles and tribulations of an architect who simply was very professional in his ideas of building and wanted a client architect relationship, not a bunch of other people chiming in and telling him what's what in terms of what's pretty, what's good in the building, and what's lasting in meaningful in a house or an estate. And he had a lot of trouble with people who were born to interfere. And Ayn Rand empowered people who operate that way. Now, when I was fooled into trusting the British, I was set up openly, very conspicuously, to represent a real life Truman Show, somebody who went along amiably with people who were making a joke out of him. And it was fairly sadistic. The women would get involved with me, make love to me, and then reject me and give some other reason than my deafness, which was obviously the reason. And it played into the sort of Superman mentality of masculinity that the feminine right wing, the most desirable of the girls, would never be loyal to a poet who was crippled. And this was a lasting laugh that people like Clint Eastwood had on the ideas of integrity that were illustrated in The Fountainhead. But the real Truman Show is the podcasting crowd. I call them the sandbaggers. George Galloway is like a child. The sandbaggers are not of the caliber of person who would say, I support the AIDS attack, but not what is being done to Gaza. So for Galloway's sake, we let them all pretend that that's not what they're saying. The sandbaggers are tricksters, but their con job is on themselves. It's a little bit like the way Lenin used disbelief as his shield in the AIDS attack. The sandbaggers lie about Mount Desert Island and use disbelief as their shield. And that's the sense that they're certainly a dead end. But the worst part about it is if you paint a picture of the politics, for example, that's around me in Tacoma, from the point of view of international law, consent between campus entities, a clerk and a student teacher, is a human right if the two of them decide to make out. It's a human right. But in the sly guerrilla theater of the Obama administration's contribution to the theater behind the AIDS attack, they made it out to be crossing a line of race and sanctimony. They even called this ridiculous stunt they pulled an adultery for good measure, which it was not. And the idea was to orchestrate a symposium promoting the idea of the burglaring of morality on behalf of the people who were behind an affirmative of the AIDS attack. And they pretended that that's not what they were doing. You have Chris Hedges and Kanvi Sharma in Seattle and Tacoma working with the Green Party, who just happened to lure me to the hot spot of ideology concerning what happened in Pittsburgh. And the cinema people who made the movie Diva and The Magic Christian, Ringo Starr himself is very heavy-handed in the lunchroom here in Tacoma, where they resonate with the idea that all of this has some spiritual legitimacy. It does not. They're just a mob who tortured me and made pornographic genocide films of me and got the sandbaggers to play their own Truman Show in defense of disbelief being used as a shield. Now, that brings me to the point about the dead end of the Workers' Party, because the sandbaggers who lack the caliber to say we support the AIDS attack but not what's being done in Gaza are allowed to pretend that there was no AIDS attack. They're allowed to lie about Mount Desert Island. And because of the way the UW dialectical makes things into a choice between the same thing, the way that Biden and Trump were a choice between genocide in Gaza and genocide in Gaza, UW dialectical does the same thing with the idea that you're either a sandbagger, in which case you're in real good with the Democratic Party machinery and Barack Obama, and you're willing to extend the graces of controversy to these individuals, even embracing Trump, as George Galloway does with his wishy-washy manner. Or you're the same thing. So you get this idea that the sandbaggers are somehow resistant to what happened in Gaza. But when you look at the situation in Seattle and Tacoma, you realize that Barack Obama is the ruling agency of the British Workers' Party and the sandbaggers. They have no truck whatsoever with the trickery of Cantu Repertoire Theater and the so-called Louis one-night stand that converted the master race psychology of the horrible genocide of generation past with the cooler genocide of Yoko Ono brought on by Lenin's Houdini, where you have an ARC system of representatives. The Two Virgins Pussy Bowl board game was an ARC representation of equity. And of course, they're doing away with the cripple. And George Galloway, in his way, is trying to resist that direction. He has protested the sanctimony of euthanasia for senior citizens, and I applaud that. I do believe that there's still a temper in our society to look after people who are infirm, but they have weaponized relative infirmity in the presentation on behalf of the attackers. In other words, if you're not scared to defend the weak and helpless, wait until we make you um, afflicted. And they go around afflicting people and stripping them of SNAP. And this cartel brags of being Ayn Rand queers and so on. People of Seattle Art Museum Authority and so on and so forth. And the sandbaggers are, as I say, like children. You have to let them pretend, or they'll start whining and throwing temper tantrums because they can't bear the thought of rational conduct when it comes to evaluating the circumstances surrounding Mount Desert Island. They want to sell Obama's idea of a theme park about sexual morality as though that's the answer to the AIDS attack. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it wasn't presented that way by the culture most affected by AIDS at the time. And the contradiction of saying the whole thing represents John Lennon is impeachable on the level of reason. And it's a small wonder that one of their totem bands, whose drumming I used to hear in the Holocaust survivor community I grew up in, the Talking Heads, said, "Stop making sense." They don't want anybody to understand. That's the way that the Truman Show is a metaphor for the Workers' Party. They don't dare understand. George Galloway is like a child, and for his sake, the sandbaggers let him pretend.